My grandma's nursing home supervisor called her stroke symptoms being stubborn and let her sit slumped for 3 days while permanent brain damage set in. So I ended her career and exposed the whole facility. My grandma Aisha is 84, sharp as a tack, and has been at Cedar Branch Assisted Living for 2 years. She has mild arthritis and uses a walker, but she manages her own schedule, reads 2 books a week, and calls me every Wednesday afternoon at 3:30 without fail. 2 Wednesdays ago, she didn't call. I tried her room phone. No answer. I called the front desk. The shift nurse Linda told me my grandma was fine, just resting. I asked her to please check in person. Linda said she would when she had a moment and hung up. An hour later, I called back. The floor supervisor, a woman named Karen, picked up. I asked her to confirm somebody had laid eyes on my grandma. Karen said Aisha had skipped dinner the night before and missed lunch that day. I asked why. Karen said, she's just being difficult lately. Some of the residents go through phases. We don't force them. I asked what she meant by phases. Karen said Aisha had refused dinner 3 nights in a row and been picky about lunch too. I told her 3 meals in a row was not a phase. That was a pattern. And I asked her again to please go check. Karen sighed audibly. She said, look, we are short-staffed today, and your grandmother has a history of being stubborn. I'll get to it when I get to it. I drove the 40 minutes. The front desk attendant asked if I had an appointment. I walked past her toward the residence wing. Karen intercepted me in the hallway and said visiting hours were ending in 20 minutes. I said I was aware. I went into the room first. My grandma was in her recliner. She was awake, but slumped to one side. Her hair, which she keeps neat every single day of her life, was matted. There was a meal tray by the door, untouched. Food that had been there for hours. I said her name. She turned her head, and only one side of her face moved. The right side of her mouth was slack. Her speech, when she tried to say my name, came out slurred. I have known this woman my entire life. I knew what I was looking at. I turned to Karen in the doorway. I asked her how long my grandma had been like this. Karen glanced at her and said, she gets moody. Sometimes she doesn't want to interact with us. I said, Karen, look at her face. Look at the right side of her face. Karen said, older folks slow down. I asked her when the last time was that anyone on staff had actually walked into this room. Karen said the meal trays had been brought in 3 times a day, and the aides had reported my grandma waving them off. I asked which aide. She didn't answer. I called 911 from the room. The paramedics were there in 11 minutes. The lead paramedic took one look at my grandma's face and told his partner to call ahead to the stroke unit. He turned to me and asked when symptoms had started. I said I didn't know, but she had missed 3 meals in a row starting Sunday night. It was Wednesday evening. He stopped writing. He looked at Karen, who was still in the doorway, and said, ma'am, when did anyone last lay eyes on this resident? Karen said residents miss meals sometimes. The paramedic didn't say anything to her. He just kept loading my grandma onto the gurney. At the hospital, the neurologist pulled up the imaging and walked me through what he was seeing. Aisha had suffered an ischemic stroke. He estimated, based on the swelling pattern, that it had occurred late Sunday or early Monday, the first missed meal. He said the window for the clot-dissolving intervention is about 4.5 hours from onset. We were closer to 72 hours past that window. He looked at me directly and said, if she had been brought in within the first day, most of this damage would not be permanent, and that the damage she is going to be living with for the rest of her life was avoidable. He said her speech might come back partially with therapy. The right side would need months of rehab, and some of it would not return. I sat in that hospital room thinking about what Karen had said. That's when I decided Karen had lived her last carefree day. By the time the sun came up, I had a plan. I wasn't going to yell. I wasn't going to cry at a front desk. I was going to build a case so tight that everyone who looked the other way had nowhere to hide. I called my best friend Layla before I left the parking lot. She picked up on the first ring. She said, tell me what you need. Aisha had given me full power of attorney 2 years ago. Karen didn't know that. By 7 a.m., I was back at the facility with the paperwork in a manila folder. I told the desk attendant I needed all of Aisha's medical records and aid check-in logs for the past 2 weeks. I slid the power of attorney across the counter. She said she needed approval. I said, 1 hour, or my next call is the state licensing board. She started dialing. Karen came around the corner 15 minutes later. Different tone this time. Softer. Almost warm. She stopped a few feet from me and said, I understand you're upset. We all care about your grandmother, but pulling records during an active care period disrupts our workflow. This was the same woman who had called a stroke a mood. Now she wanted to talk about workflow. I said, Karen, my grandmother had a stroke in your care and nobody noticed for 3 days. Workflow is the last thing I'm worried about. She crossed her arms. She said, your grandmother is a proud woman. She waves people off. She refuses help. We documented that. That was the moment I knew I had her. If they documented it, there was a paper trail. I said, then let me see exactly that documentation. Karen went quiet. Then she walked back toward the offices without another word. 45 minutes later, someone from records came out with a thick envelope. I signed the release. I called Layla from the parking lot and we met at the hospital cafeteria. She had 2 coffees and a notebook. We took a back corner table and started going through the records page by page. The daily check-in logs were first. Aides are supposed to fill these out every shift. Morning, afternoon, night. Each entry has the date, the shift, whether meals were delivered, and a line that says resident observed with a place to initial. For Aisha's room, every single shift for the past week had a check mark. Meals delivered, check. Resident observed, check. Initialed, check. It all looked perfect on paper. Then Layla leaned over and pointed at the initials. The handwriting on every single check mark was the same, not similar, the same. The same loop on the top of the initial. The same pressure on the pen. The same person had signed off on every shift for 7 straight days. 3 shifts a day, 7 days in a row. 21 entries, all in the same handwriting. That is physically impossible unless one person was working around the clock without sleeping, which obviously didn't happen. Someone had sat down and filled in those logs all at once. They checked boxes for shifts they were never present for. They wrote resident observed on lines where nobody ever walked into that room. My grandma was sitting in her recliner having a stroke, and someone in a back office was checking a box that said they had seen her and she was fine. Layla said, this isn't just lazy, this is fake. I called Raphael, a family friend who works as a patient advocate at a different hospital system. I read him the whole timeline. The missed meals, Karen's words, the paramedic, the neurologist's window, then the logs, the identical handwriting on 21 entries. Raphael went silent, not distracted, silent, processing silent. After a long pause, he said, that's not negligence. That's falsified medical documentation. You need to file with the state health department today, not tomorrow. Today. I asked him to explain. He said a facility submitting care logs showing observations that never happened isn't a mistake or cutting corners. It's fraud. He said falsifying records when a patient is harmed can trigger a full state investigation. He walked me through the complaint form. Include the logs. Include the neurologist's report and timeline. Include my own account. Request a surprise inspection. Give them no notice. Then he said, this isn't just about Karen anymore. If those logs are falsified, the facility itself is liable. The stakes just went from Karen losing her job to this place potentially losing its license. I filed the complaint that hour. Layla took phone photos of the logs. I attached everything. I hit submit and felt something click into place. Not relief, something solid. The next day, Layla and I went back to the facility. I needed to talk to the aides directly. I found the first one in the break room. She was young, maybe mid-20s. The second she saw me, her whole body went stiff. I kept my voice calm. I said I wasn't there to get her in trouble. I just wanted to know what happened. She looked at the door behind me. Then she leaned forward and whispered, Karen told us to stop going into rooms unless we were called. She said it saved time and residents preferred privacy. That confirmed it. This wasn't one person making a bad call. This was a policy. From the top of the floor. From Karen. Aides told to leave residents alone unless the resident asked. I asked her if she had checked on my grandma Sunday night. She shook her head. She said, I brought the tray. I knocked. She didn't answer. I left it by the door. That's what Karen told us to do. I thanked her. I didn't push. I found the second aide in a supply closet down the hall. An older man, gray at the temples, restocking towels on a metal cart. He told me he didn't want to get involved. I told him my grandma couldn't move the right side of her body and could barely say my name. He stopped what he was doing. He looked at the floor. Then he said, I told Karen on Monday that your grandmother looked off. She told me your grandmother was going through one of her moods and to leave her alone. Karen had taken a man's instinct and shut it down, called a stroke a mood. I asked him to put it in writing. His face closed up. He said, if Karen finds out I talked to you, I'll be out of a job by Friday. I told him if the state investigators found out he knew something was wrong and said nothing on paper, it would be worse than losing this job. He stared at me a long time. Then he nodded once. Karen rounded the corner before I left the floor. She'd heard. She walked up to me and said I was disrupting her staff. She lowered her voice and said if I continued, she would restrict my visitation to scheduled hours with a staff escort. I said, you do that, Karen. Put it in writing. I'd love to show the state inspector you restricted family access while under investigation. Her eyes got wider. Her mouth opened and closed. She had no idea I had already filed. She turned and walked away. 2 days later, the facility administrator, a man named Byron, called and asked me in for a family meeting. He said it was to discuss Aisha's care plan. Calm, almost rehearsed. Layla said it sounded like a trap. I went anyway, with everything in a folder. Copies of the falsified check-in logs with the identical handwriting circled in red. The older aide's written statement, the neurologist's report, the state complaint confirmation. Byron met us in a conference room. Tall, gray suit, blue tie, practiced handshake. Karen was already seated, arms crossed tight, jaw set, looking at a spot on the wall behind my head. She didn't greet me. Byron slid a document across the table. A single page, on facility letterhead. Incident report. The date listed was the Monday after I had first visited. The report said Aisha had presented with mild fatigue and reduced appetite, and that staff monitored her condition and noted no acute changes. Clean professional language. It sounded official. It sounded like someone had done their job. I read it twice. I set it down. I said, this wasn't filed Monday. This was created yesterday. Byron's expression didn't change, but his fingers tapped the table once. I said, my grandmother was slumped in a chair with one side of her face paralyzed. Your report says mild fatigue. Byron leaned back. He said, our staff followed protocol. Your grandmother has a documented history of refusing assistance. We can't force residents to accept care. That word again. Protocol. Like protocol was a shield. Like saying we followed the rules was going to undo 3 days of brain damage. I reached into my folder and pulled out the check-in logs. I spread them out on the table so both Byron and Karen could see them. I said, then explain why every shift for the past week was initialed by the same person. 21 entries, same handwriting. Unless you have someone on staff who doesn't sleep, someone sat down and filled these out all at once for shifts they were never present for. Byron looked at the logs, then he looked at Karen. A quick look, but I caught it. He was waiting for her to say something. Karen said nothing. She didn't move. She didn't look at the logs. She just stared at the wall behind my head. The silence in that room was heavy. Byron pivoted. He folded his hands on the table and said, I'd like to offer your family a resolution. We're prepared to cover any out-of-pocket rehab costs for your grandmother and to assign her a dedicated care aide going forward. In exchange, we'd ask that you withdraw the state complaint and allow us to handle this internally. I didn't say anything right away. The rehab costs were going to be real. Insurance wouldn't cover most of it. I had been up the night before looking at therapy numbers and they made my stomach hurt. For a second, maybe two, I thought about it. Layla put her hand on my arm under the table, not squeezing, just resting there. I looked at Byron. I said, you're offering to pay for rehab costs that exist because your staff let my grandmother sit in a chair having a stroke for 3 days. And the price is, I let you investigate yourselves and keep Karen in her position. Byron said, I'm offering a path forward that benefits your grandmother directly. I pushed my chair back and stood up. I picked up the folder. I said, my grandmother can't say my name clearly anymore, Byron. She can't hold a book. You don't get to make this go away with a check. Karen still hadn't moved. She hadn't said a single word since we sat down. Byron opened his mouth. I was already walking. Layla was right behind me. We walked down the hallway, through the lobby, and out the front doors without stopping. The sunlight hit my face and I realized I had been holding my breath. We got in the car. My hands were shaking. Layla said, you did the right thing. I stared through the windshield at the brick wall of the building where my grandma lived. I said, I just turned down money she needs, Layla. Layla said, I know, but if you take it, Karen keeps her job. And the next family that puts someone they love in that building gets the same phone call you got, the same hallway, the same excuses. I knew she was right. I knew it in my bones. But knowing you did the right thing and feeling good about it are two different things. I second-guessed myself the whole drive home. That night, Raphael called. He said the state had flagged my complaint as high priority because of the falsified documentation evidence. An inspector was being assigned. He said, could be this week, could be next week, but it's happening. 2 days later, I got a letter in the mail. Plain white envelope, facility return address, typed on letterhead. Notice of visitation restructuring. Due to repeated disruption of staff operations and interference with care protocols, my visitation was now restricted to a 2-hour window on Tuesdays and Thursdays only, with a staff escort required at all times. Any visit outside those hours would be considered trespassing. Signed by Byron. I read it 3 times. They were cutting me off off from my own grandmother, the woman who raised me. They were telling me I could see her 4 hours a week with a babysitter watching. This wasn't workload, this was punishment. They were building a wall between me and the truth and hoping it would hold long enough for them to get their story straight before the state showed up. The next morning, the older aide called me. His voice was tight and fast. He said, "Karen found out I gave you a statement. She pulled me into her office and told me if I didn't retract it, she'd report me for patient neglect and make sure I never worked in care again." I asked him if he had retracted. He said he told her he would think about it. I said, "Listen to me. If you retract that statement, you're the one who looks like he's lying when the inspector comes, not Karen. You'll have a written statement saying one thing and a retraction saying the opposite. The inspector is going to want to know why you changed your story. Karen is not going to protect you when that happens. She is going to let you take the fall." He said, "I know, but I have a family. I can't lose this job." Then he hung up. I called Raphael. I told him the witness was about to fold. He said, "You still have the falsified logs. You still have the neurologist's report and the timeline. One witness is helpful, but the paperwork doesn't lie. Focus on what they can't retract." He was right. The handwriting on the 21 entries wasn't going to change because someone got scared. The neurologist's report wasn't going to suddenly say the stroke happened an hour ago instead of 72. The evidence was still real, but the ground was shifting. Then I remembered something the young aide had told me in the break room. She said Karen told them to stop going into rooms unless they were called. That wasn't a moment. That was a policy. And if it had been in place for months, my grandma wasn't the only one. Raphael helped me pull contact information for 3 other families with residents on the same floor. I called each one and asked the same question. Had their family member ever gone a full day without anyone on staff checking on them? The first family said yes. Their mother had been in bed with what turned out to be pneumonia and nobody noticed until the next morning. The second family wasn't sure but suspected their uncle had been left alone for long stretches because his room always looked exactly the same when they visited, like nobody had been in there. The third call was different. The woman started crying when I asked. She said her father had fallen in his bathroom and wasn't found for 14 hours. 14 hours on a tile floor with a broken hip. She had filed a complaint. Karen had personally called her back and told her it was an isolated incident, that her father had locked the bathroom door from the inside and staff couldn't have known. The woman said there was no lock on that bathroom door. She had checked. It wasn't isolated. It was a pattern. The day before the inspector was scheduled, my phone rang. I didn't recognize the number. It was Karen. Her voice was shaky, like she was calling from somewhere private and trying to hold herself together. She said, "I have worked in this industry for 22 years. I've been short-staffed for 5 of them. I've asked for more hires every quarter and been denied. The system is broken and I'm just trying to hold it together." I said, "Karen, you told your aides not to enter rooms unless they were called. You looked at my grandmother slumped in a chair and called it a mood. You didn't hold the system together. You let it crush her." The line went quiet. Then her voice dropped lower. She said, "I'm sorry about your grandmother. I mean that. But if you go through with this, they won't just fire me. They'll close the floor. Byron has already told the board he'll shut down the wing rather than deal with a state investigation. 32 residents will need to be relocated. Some of them have nowhere to go." She was putting those 32 people on my shoulders and hoping I would buckle. I hung up without saying goodbye. I called Raphael. He said facilities threaten closure all the time during investigations, and the state had a relocation process. I asked him if it could still happen. He paused. He said, "It could." I sat in my car in a grocery store parking lot for a long time. I thought about the next grandma, the next resident who skips a meal, and then 2, and then 3, and nobody walks in. I called the state health department and asked them to confirm my complaint was still active. They confirmed. The surprise inspection was scheduled for Monday. I said, "Thank you. I'll be there." The state inspector arrived unannounced the following Monday. A woman in her 50s with short gray hair, a clipboard, a badge clipped to her belt. Byron came out of the offices smiling, hand already extended. She didn't take it. She let it hang there in the air between them. Then she said, "I'll need access to all resident care logs for the past 90 days, staff schedules, and I'll be conducting private interviews with floor staff. Please designate a room." Byron's hand dropped. His smile faded like a dimmer turning down. The back of his neck went red above his collar. I stepped forward and told the inspector I was the one who had filed the complaint. I handed her the folder, falsified logs, neurologist timeline, the older aide's written statement, my own account. She took it. She didn't flip through it. She held it at her side and said, "Thank you. I'll review this as part of my assessment." Across the lobby, Byron was watching. His smile was completely gone. Layla and I waited in the visitor lounge. The young aide went in first. 15 minutes. She came out looking pale but lighter, like she had set something down. The older man went in next. Almost 30 minutes. When he came out, he stopped in the hallway, turned his head, and gave me one small nod through the lounge window. He had told the truth. Karen went in last. 43 minutes. When she came out, she didn't look at anyone. She walked straight into her office and shut the door. Byron went in after her and came out looking like a man doing math he couldn't solve. The inspector found me before she left. She said, "I can't discuss findings before the report is filed, but what you documented was thorough, and the interviews corroborated your timeline. The department will be in contact with your family within 10 business days." 2 weeks later, the state report came back. The facility was cited for falsified patient monitoring records, failure to identify and respond to acute medical symptoms, and inadequate staff supervision. Karen was terminated. Byron was placed on administrative probation. The facility was required to implement new check-in protocols, hire additional staff, and submit to quarterly surprise inspections for 2 years. The wing stayed open. The other residents stayed. My grandma still can't say my name.